Australia is being run for everyone except Australians. Australians are not angry because they are selfish, they are angry because they can feel, in their daily lives, that the system no longer works for them. Housing is unaffordable, hospitals are overwhelmed, wages lag behind living costs, communities are stretched thin. Yet time and again, Australians are told there is no money, no capacity, or no alternative, while billions are committed overseas. Assets are sold off, borders are kept wide open, and foreign interests are prioritised ahead of the people who built this country. This is not about isolationism, it is about responsibility. A government's first duty is to its own citizens. Mass immigration in a time of crisis. Australia continues to run historically high immigration levels during a housing shortage, infrastructure crisis, and cost of living emergency. Demand is being imported faster than we can build homes, staff hospitals, or expand schools. Rents soar, wages are suppressed, and everyday Australians are forced to compete for essentials in their own country. Australians are told this is economic necessity, yet the benefits flow upward to property investors, large corporations, and GDP figures, while the costs are carried by workers, families, and young people locked out of home ownership. Population growth has become an ideology, not a service to the nation. Foreign ownership and the sell-off of Australia. Australian homes, farmland, ports, and infrastructure are increasingly treated as commodities to be sold rather than national assets to be protected. Foreign ownership drives prices higher, sends profits offshore, and erodes long-term sovereignty. Australians are left renting in their own country while global capital accumulates Australian land and resources. A nation that cannot control who owns its essentials is not truly in control of its future. Trade, globalization, and the decline of Australian industry. Successive governments have prioritised global trade relationships over domestic capability. Manufacturing has been hollowed out, local producers are undercut by imports made under lower standards. Australia exports raw materials cheaply and buys back finished goods at a premium. We have become dependent instead of resilient, efficient on paper, fragile in reality. Wages, jobs, and the undermining of Australian workers. Temporary visa programs and outsourced labour have weakened bargaining power for Australian workers. Businesses are incentivised to import labour rather than train Australians. Wage growth stalls, conditions erode, and enforcement remains weak. A strong nation protects the dignity of its workforce. Australia no longer does. Foreign policy over national interest. Australia increasingly aligns itself with international strategies that come with real costs at home. We fund overseas conflicts, send resources abroad, and make long-term commitments, while our own defence readiness declines. The ADF faces recruitment and retention crises, outdated equipment, and delayed capability. Australians ask a simple question: how can we afford global military obligations while struggling to defend our own territory? Outsourcing national security to foreign interests. Perhaps most alarming is the outsourcing of security at Australian military bases and critical infrastructure foreign-owned or foreign-linked companies. Australians are told this is efficient, yet it raises serious questions about sovereignty, intelligence risk, and national control. A country that relies on foreign entities to guard its military assets is no longer fully sovereign. International aid while Australians are left behind. Australia sends billions in international aid while Australians face overcrowded hospitals and ambulance ramping, underfunded mental health services, schools stretched beyond capacity, police shortages, and rising burnout. At the same time, homelessness is rising, food banks are overwhelmed, and working Australians are sleeping in cars and tents. Compassion is a virtue, but it must start at home. A nation that cannot care for its own people has no moral authority to lecture the world. Infrastructure in decline, communities abandoned. Roads crumble, public transport fails, flood and fire-prone communities rebuild again and again with no lasting solutions. Australians pay high taxes, high energy costs, and high rents, yet receive declining standards in return. We are told to accept less so Australia can look good internationally. Elites are shielded, Australians pay the price. Political leaders, senior bureaucrats, and corporate executives are insulated from the consequences of their decisions. They own property while housing collapses, they benefit from globalization. While communities fracture, they speak of resilience while Australians struggle to survive. This disconnect is why trust has evaporated. Identity, cohesion, and the loss of the national conversation. Rapid change without integration, limits, or public consent weakens social cohesion. Australians are told not to ask questions about values, culture, or national identity, while the foundations of shared civic life quietly erode. A nation is more than an economy, it is a people with shared obligations, rights, and responsibilities. The core truth Australians feel. Australia is no longer being governed as a nation, but as an economic zone. Growth is prioritised over well-being, global approval over democratic consent, foreign interests over Australian lives. This is why anger grows, this is why people feel unheard, this is why faith in institutions is collapsing. The principle that must be restored. This is not radical, it is foundational. Government exists to serve its people first, not foreign investors, not global institutions, not international optics. Australians are not asking for special treatment, they are asking not to be last. And until that changes, the system will continue to fracture, not because Australians are divided, but because they are being ignored. Why this path risks civilizational decline. Civilizations rarely collapse overnight, they decay slowly, then all at once. History shows that collapse does not usually come from invasion or catastrophe alone, but from internal failure, when institutions stop serving the people they exist to protect. What Australians are experiencing today matches many of the warning signs seen in declining societies throughout history. Loss of legitimacy in institutions. Civilization depends on trust. When people believe the government no longer represents them, the system is rigged against ordinary citizens, sacrifice is demanded only from the public, not from elites, legitimacy erodes. Once legitimacy is gone, laws are obeyed less, civic participation collapses, and social cooperation breaks down. People stop believing in the future because they no longer feel part of it. A system without trust cannot endure. Economic extraction replaces national investment. Collapsing societies shift from building to extracting. Australia increasingly extracts wealth from workers through high living costs, extracts land value through speculation rather than production, extracts resources without building. Downstream industries, meanwhile, profits flow offshore and reinvestment declines. When an economy stops improving life for its people, growth becomes meaningless and resentment becomes inevitable. Overextension and misaligned priorities. Empires and states often collapse when they take on external obligations they can no longer sustain internally, funding overseas conflicts, international aid, global commitments, while domestic infrastructure decays, defense readiness declines. Social systems fracture creates a fatal imbalance. You cannot maintain global responsibilities while neglecting national foundations. History is ruthless on this point. Social fragmentation and the loss of shared identity. A civilization is not just infrastructure, it is shared meaning. Rapid demographic change without integration, combined with economic stress, housing competition, cultural silencing of legitimate concerns leads to fragmentation. People retreat into tribes, trust between groups weakens, the sense of community disappears. Once a society no longer agrees on who it is or what it stands for, it becomes impossible to govern democratically. Elite detachment, the final warning sign. One of the most consistent predictors of collapse is elite insulation, when leaders are shielded from consequences, benefit from the very policies harming the public, dismiss dissent as ignorance or extremism. They stop correcting course. At that point, collapse is no longer a choice. It becomes a process. The public becomes disengaged. Systems hollow out. Crisis accelerates. What collapse looks like, not Mad Max, but decline. Civilizational collapse in modern societies does not look like chaos overnight. It looks like permanent housing insecurity, declining life expectancy, normalized homelessness, crumbling services, increasing authoritarianism to manage dissent, a population that no longer believes tomorrow will be better. Collapse is not an event, it is a steady lowering of expectations until survival replaces hope. Why this is still preventable? The most dangerous myth is that collapse is inevitable. It isn't. But prevention requires reprioritizing citizens over global optics, rebuilding domestic capability and resilience, restoring trust through accountability, reasserting sovereignty, economic, cultural, and political. Civilisations survive when they remember who they exist for. The choice before Australia. Australia still has a choice, but the window is not infinite. Nations do not collapse because people speak up. They collapse because warnings are ignored. Australians are not demanding perfection, they are demanding priority, and unless that demand is answered, history tells us exactly what comes next.